Hey everyone, tonight we're traveling to a place where the air is thin and the mountains scrape the belly of the sky. You're standing on a dusty plateau in the Peruvian Andes, thousands of feet above the sea. The wind is a relentless sculptor, carving the rock and chilling you to the bone through your modern fleece jacket. Below you, the ruins of a city you've never heard of sprawl in the amber light of a setting sun. There's a faint, sweet, and slightly spicy smell on the air, like forgotten fruit fermenting under the earth. You probably wouldn't survive this, by the way. The altitude sickness alone would likely send you back to sea level with a headache that feels like a blacksmith is using your skull for an anvil. Never mind trying to navigate the complex social rules of a civilization dead for 1,000 years. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're re-listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where these stories land. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the crunch of ancient dust under your boots. The world up here is a stark palette of ochre, rust, and the deep, profound blue of the high-altitude sky. You're in the heart of what was once the Wari Empire, a civilization that rose, dominated a vast stretch of South America, and vanished centuries before the Inca ever built Machu Picchu. And if you've never heard of them, you're not alone. The Wari are history's quiet giants, the ones who laid the groundwork, built the roads, and perfected the systems that their more famous successors would later claim credit for. They are the ghost empire of the Andes, and the secret to their success, the engine of their expansion, wasn't the sword or gold or even a charismatic king. It was beer. Now, when you hear beer, you're probably thinking of a cold pint after work, something you grab with friends. Forget that. We're talking about a brew that was the lifeblood of an entire political system. The Wari figured out something profound about human nature. If you want people to build your roads, fight your wars, and accept your authority, you don't just command them. You indebt them with generosity. You create a social fabric so strong, so tightly woven with threads of reciprocity and obligation, that compliance becomes the natural path. And the loom for this fabric was the state-sponsored feast, where thousands of gallons of a special pink peppery beer made from the berries of the Molle tree flowed freely. Imagine trying to run a modern country on that platform. Vote for me and the drinks are on the house. It sounds absurd, but the Wari didn't just make it work. They used it to build one of the most complex societies of its time. This was a civilization that flourished between roughly 600 and 1000 AD. At its height, the Wari controlled a territory stretching nearly 1,000 miles along the Andes, from the dry northern coast of Peru down into the mountainous south. They were masters of terrace agriculture, turning impossibly steep mountainsides into productive farmland. They were brilliant textile artists, weaving intricate tapestries that served as a visual language we are still trying to fully decipher. And they were engineers, constructing administrative centers and a road system that would become the foundation of the later Inca Royal Road. They managed to unite a dizzying array of different peoples and environments: coastal fishermen, highland potato farmers, jungle dwellers, all without the use of a written script. They left us no grand histories, no king lists, no tax records. All we have are the things they left behind: their pots, their buildings, their bones, and the silent stories they tell. Because of this lack of writing, the Wari have long been a puzzle for archaeologists. For a long time, they were seen as little more than a cultural influence, a style of pottery that spread across the region. The idea of them as a cohesive, powerful state is relatively new, pieced together through decades of painstaking excavation. And even now, the exact nature of their power is a hot topic. Historians still argue whether the Wari state was a centrally controlled, coercive empire, in the way we might think of Rome, with legions and governors enforcing the will of a distant emperor, or if it was a more decentralized collection of powerful centers that projected influence through culture, religion, and, of course, these grand feasts. Was it a conquest state that ruled by force, or was it a network held together by shared beliefs and the irresistible allure of a really good party? The truth is likely somewhere in between, a complex tapestry of hard and soft power. But whatever the model, The mechanism is becoming clearer. The Wari elite weren't just throwing parties for fun. They were engaging in a highly sophisticated form of political theater. Each feast was a calculated display of wealth and power. By providing enormous quantities of food, and most importantly, chicha, the Andean term for fermented beverages, the state wasn't just being generous. It was demonstrating its supernatural ability to provide abundance in a harsh and unpredictable world. It was creating a debt. When you, as a local leader or a simple farmer, partook in that feast, you accepted a social contract. You drank the state's beer, and in return, you owed the state your labor. This system, a kind of labor tax, is what built the Wari world. The beer wasn't just a beverage, it was a liquid currency of obligation. It was the social lubricant that allowed the gears of a complex, non-market economy to turn smoothly, building a world from the ground up, one drink at a time. It's a far cry from a trip to the hardware store, isn't it? I'll help you build that retaining wall, Dave, but you owe me 3 gallons of psychoactive pepperberry beer. It just doesn't have the same ring to it. That liquid currency was brewed and poured in a very specific place, a place that shaped the very nature of the Wari state. To understand their solution, you first have to appreciate the problem. So, let's stay here for a moment, on this high plateau, and feel the world the Wari inhabited. You're in the Ayacucho Basin of modern-day Peru, the cradle of their civilization. The first thing that hits you again is the air, or the lack of it. At an average elevation of over 9,000 feet, that's nearly 3 kilometers straight up, every breath is a conscious effort. Your lungs burn, your head feels light. Now imagine farming here. Imagine building a city here. The landscape is immense, almost intimidatingly so. The colors are earthy and sun-bleached. During the long dry season, which lasts for much of the year, the world is shades of beige and brown under a sun of impossible intensity. The wind, which you remember from our introduction, never seems to stop, carrying fine dust that gets into your eyes, your clothes, everything. Then comes the wet season. It doesn't arrive gently. It comes in furious, concentrated bursts of rain that can turn the dry, cracked earth into a torrent of mud. This is not a land of gentle streams and rolling green hills. It's a place of extremes, a vertical world of deep ravines and sharp peaks where life clings to the margins. Survival here is an achievement. Building a civilization, a true regional power, is something else entirely. It's a masterpiece of human ingenuity. This demanding environment is precisely why the Wari became who they were. They were forced to innovate. Looking around, you see the evidence etched into the very mountainsides. They are ribbed with ancient terraces called Andenes. These aren't just a few garden steps, these are vast engineered landscapes, stone retaining walls built by hand, creating level platforms for farming that climb thousands of feet up the slopes. These terraces prevented soil erosion from the violent rains, captured precious water, and even created microclimates that allowed different crops to grow at different elevations. The Wari and their ancestors didn't just live on the land, they remade it. They sculpted the earth on a scale that rivals any of the great works of the ancient world. Makes you feel a bit silly for complaining about the price of kale at the supermarket when these people were literally moving mountains for a crop of quinoa. This mastery of the immediate environment was coupled with a truly brilliant insight into the wider geography of the Andes. You're standing in the highlands, the Sierra, where potatoes and high-altitude grains like quinoa thrive. But the Wari understood that their world was vertical. A day or two's walk down valley, the air gets thicker and warmer, and you enter the zone where maize, the crucial ingredient for the most prestigious forms of chicha, grows best. Go even further, and you reach the steamy jungle fringe, the selva, source of coca leaves, exotic birds for their feathers, and hallucinogenic plants for their rituals. If you were to travel west from the Ayacucho Basin, you'd descend to the arid coast, a source of fish, salt, and seashells. The Wari established outposts and colonies in all of these different ecological zones. Archaeologists call this the vertical archipelago model. It was a strategy of controlling not a contiguous block of land, but a series of resource-rich islands at different elevations. This gave them access to a variety of foods and goods that no single location could provide. A diversified portfolio against starvation. It was a uniquely Andean solution to an Andean problem. So what prompted them to expand this system beyond their home region and create a vast interconnected empire? What was the spark? Historians still argue whether the initial explosive expansion of the Wari was a matter of deliberate military conquest, a kind of manifest destiny to spread their powerful religion, or if it was a desperate response to survival. There is compelling evidence that a massive climate event, likely a prolonged and severe drought, struck the Andes in the 6th century AD, right around the time the Wari began to expand. Imagine the rains failing year after year in the Ayacucho Basin. The terraces would dry up, the crops would wither. Suddenly, controlling those more stable, well-watered valleys further down the mountains isn't just a good idea. It's a matter of life and death. In this scenario, the feasts take on a new, more urgent meaning. A Wari leader who could, through superior organization and control of diverse resources, still manage to throw a lavish party in the middle of a drought would seem like a miracle worker. His chicha would taste like salvation. Offering this abundance to neighboring groups wouldn't just be a political maneuver. It would be a lifeline. You can almost hear the pitch. Your crops are failing and your gods are silent. Come to our city. Our storehouses are full, our gods are pleased, and our beer flows freely. All we ask in return is your loyalty and your labor. In a world of scarcity and fear, that's an offer that's hard to refuse. It's the ultimate recruitment strategy. And so from this harsh, unforgiving crucible of high-altitude life, the Wari emerged, not just as survivors, but as masters of their world, ready to export their unique model of society, fueled by resilience, organization, and a whole lot of beer. So you have this incredibly resilient people, shaped by a demanding landscape, who developed a unique political system based on state-sponsored hospitality. But how do you get to know them? How do you move past the grand sketch of their politics and into the details of their culture, their beliefs, their very identity? With most ancient empires, you'd turn to their writing. You'd read the boastful inscriptions of a king carved into a monument. You'd decipher a legal code on a clay tablet, or you'd pore over religious texts written on papyrus. With the Wari, you can't do any of that. You reach for their books and find the shelf completely empty. The Wari had no system of writing that we have been able to identify. Let that sink in for a moment. They built cities, managed a multi-ethnic empire across 1,000 miles of punishing terrain, and created a complex state apparatus, all without a single written word. This is one of the things that makes them so spectral, so difficult to grasp. Their voice is gone, carried away on that same relentless wind that scours the highlands. To understand them, you can't be a linguist, you have to become an art historian, a decoder of silent symbols. You have to learn to read their clothes and their pottery. Let's imagine you're in a climate-controlled room, far from the Andean dust, and an archaeologist carefully lays a Wari tunic before you. It is over 1,000 years old, yet the colors are so shockingly vibrant they seem to hum with energy. Deep crimson from cochineal insects, brilliant indigo, rich yellows and greens from desert plants. Your favorite black t-shirt probably looks more faded after a year than this tunic does after a millennium. This incredible preservation is a gift from the other side of the Wari world, the bone-dry coastal deserts where many of their elite were buried. The sand wicked away all moisture, creating a perfect, oxygen-poor time capsule. These textiles weren't just clothing. They were the most valuable things the Wari produced. In Andean cultures, textiles were a primary form of wealth and a sacred substance, often valued far more than gold or silver. The amount of labor required to harvest the fine wool from alpacas and vicuñas, spin it into thread thinner than a human hair dye it, with rare pigments and then weave it into a dense tapestry-like fabric was astronomical. You lean closer and see that the tunic is covered in images. It's a language of its own. You see geometric patterns that seem to shift and interlock, creating a sense of dynamic energy. And within these patterns, figures repeat. The most prominent is a powerful, front-facing deity. Its eyes are large and round, and it holds a staff or a stalk of maize in each hand. Rays, perhaps of lighter feathers, emanate from its head. Attending the central figure are smaller winged beings, always shown in profile, as if running towards or away from the main god. This is the staff god, a central figure in Andean cosmology for thousands of years, and the Wari were its greatest evangelists. This wasn't just a pretty picture. The specific combination of images, the layout, the colors, it all communicated the wearer's identity, their social rank, their ethnic affiliation, and their place in the cosmos. Wearing this tunic was like wearing your passport, your resume, and your statement of faith all at once. The same visual code is repeated on their pottery. You pick up a drinking cup. It's heavy, solid, the surface polished to a glossy sheen. It's painted with the same bold, abstract style. Not the work of a single artist expressing themselves, but a standardized, state-sanctioned aesthetic. This was the Wari brand, a unified visual identity that was instantly recognizable across their vast realm. Finding a pot with this exact iconography in a distant mountain valley is the archaeological equivalent of finding a McDonald's wrapper on Mars. It tells you, unequivocally, that the Wari were here. But was this visual language the only way they stored information? Was it all just pictures and memory? Maybe not. You've probably heard of the Inca quipu, the fascinating and complex system of knotted strings they used to record everything from census data to historical narratives. For a long time, it was thought to be a unique Inca invention. But now, historians still argue whether the Wari used a form of quipu as well. In Wari tombs, particularly at their capital city, archaeologists have discovered bundles of colored strings, tightly twisted from camelid fiber. They don't have the same complex knots as Inca quipus, but they are clearly deliberate, organized objects. Were they simply decorative tassels from a dignitary's outfit? Or were they a true precursor to the quipu, an early form of information technology? If the Wari did have this system, it would mean they had a form of administration far more detailed and data-driven than we ever imagined. It's a tantalizing mystery. These silent strings, like their silent textiles, hold secrets we are still trying to coax out of them, whispering clues to how a people with no books managed to run a world. For now, we are left to read the stories in their art, a language of gods and power, a language that was understood from the desert to the jungle, often with a cup of beer in hand. So you're standing there in the past holding a piece of Wari pottery, a cup that acts as a page from their silent book. And as you raise it, you catch that scent we imagined earlier, sweet, spicy, and fermented. It's the ghost of the drink that once filled this vessel. What exactly was it? When we think of foundational ancient drinks, we think of wine from grapes in the Mediterranean, or beer from barley in Mesopotamia. But the Wari took a different path, one dictated by their unique environment. Their power came from a tree. You leave the imagined museum and walk out into the Andean sunlight. Your guide, a figure from the past, points to a gnarled, weeping tree with delicate fern-like leaves. It looks a bit like a willow crossed with a pepper plant, and it's dotted with clusters of bright pink berries that hang like tiny festive ornaments. This is Molle, the Peruvian pepper tree. It's a scrappy, resilient species, perfectly adapted to this high, dry world. It laughs at drought, thrives in poor soil, and digs its roots deep into the rocky ground. In a landscape where every resource was precious, the Molle tree was a gift from the gods, a reliable, low-maintenance source of profound power. It was the camel of the Andean plant world and just as essential. You reach out and pluck one of the berry clusters. They're no bigger than peppercorns and surprisingly light. You roll one between your thumb and forefinger and the thin, brittle pink shell cracks, revealing a dark seed. A sharp, pleasant, peppery scent fills the air. On a dare from your imaginary guide, you pop one in your mouth. The first sensation is an intense, resinous sweetness that coats your tongue. This is the sugar that the yeast will later turn into alcohol. But right after the sweet hit comes a spicy kick, a peppery bite that gives the berry its name. It's a complex, surprising flavor. This is the raw material for an empire. You're tasting the very beginning of a political process. But to see this tree as just a source of fermentable sugar would be like calling the internet a glorified telephone. The Molle was the Swiss Army knife of the Wari botanical world. Andean peoples used every single part of this sacred plant. The strong, pliable wood was used for tools. The sticky, resinous sap that oozed from its bark was used as a powerful adhesive, a natural superglue for mending pottery or securing tools. Some early Spanish chroniclers even recorded that this sap was used as a component in the complex process of mummification, a kind of embalming fluid to preserve the bodies of revered ancestors. The leaves, when crushed, release a potent cleansing aroma and were bundled together and used in rituals, brushed over people to purify them of negative energy. And the berries themselves were a one-stop pharmacy. Chewing them was a remedy for a sore throat or a toothache. Ground into a poultice, they were applied to the skin to treat rheumatism and swelling. The berries have natural antibacterial and antiseptic properties, making them an effective all-purpose medicine. And as a final trick, when dried and scattered around a food storeroom, their peppery scent acted as a powerful natural insecticide, protecting precious stores of maize and quinoa from weevils and other pests. It's your drink, your medicine, your spiritual cleanser, your glue, and your bug spray. Today it would be marketed as some ludicrously expensive superfood, probably sold in a minimalist pouch with a hefty price tag. For the Wari, it was simply life. This brings us to a fascinating and intoxicating question. When thousands of people gathered at a Wari feast to drink chicha de mole, what was the experience really like? Was it just a boisterous, alcohol-fueled party? Or was it something more? Historians still argue whether the primary draw of chicha de mole was its intoxicating alcoholic effect, or if other, more subtle psychoactive compounds within the berries played a key role in its ritual significance. It's a debate about whether the goal was intoxication or transformation. Alcohol, of course, is a powerful social tool. It lowers inhibitions, fosters camaraderie, and creates feelings of euphoria and fellowship, all things you'd want at a state-building feast. But some researchers suggest that Chinas Molle contains other compounds that, when fermented and consumed in large quantities, could have had mild mood-altering or even vision-inducing properties. If this is true, then drinking at a Wari feast wasn't just about feeling good. It was about seeing differently. It would have transformed the event from a political rally into a collective spiritual experience. The chicha would have been a sacrament, a chemical key that unlocked a different state of consciousness, allowing the participants to feel more deeply connected to each other, to the state, and to the gods whose images they saw on their cups and tunics. The mild psychoactive buzz would have made the political messaging of the feast not just audible, but palpable. It's a tantalizing thought that the Wari state was built not just on social debt but on a shared, chemically induced state of spiritual communion. The humble Molle tree, then, was not just a resource, it was a portal. That Molle tree is indeed a portal, but a portal that requires a key. You can't just eat the berries and expect to build a society. You have to transform them. So, how did the Wari do it? How did they turn these tiny, spicy, sweet fruits into thousands upon thousands of gallons of political capital? You follow the scent of wood smoke and something sweet and boiling, and you find yourself in a bustling, sun-drenched courtyard. This is a Wari brewery. Forget any images you have of gleaming copper vats and men in rubber boots. This is an open-air, communal operation, and it's run almost entirely by women. The air is thick with steam and the sound of women's voices chatting and singing as they work. It feels less like a factory and more like a community kitchen, albeit one preparing for a feast of epic proportions. Large, beautifully crafted ceramic jars, some as tall as a person, are propped up over carefully tended fires. This is where the magic happens. The first step is surprisingly gentle. The harvested Molle berries are placed in a vessel of water and are carefully agitated, rubbed by hand. The goal isn't to crush the berries, but simply to wash off that sweet, resinous coating you tasted earlier. The water quickly becomes cloudy, taking on a milky, pinkish hue. This liquid, a simple solution of sugar and water, is the foundation of the brew. It's the canvas upon which the chicha will be built. This sweet water is then poured into one of the large brewing vats. Now comes the part of the process that might challenge your modern sensibilities. For the most potent chichas, especially those that needed a higher alcohol content, the Wari would supplement the Molle sugars with the starches from maize. But there's a problem. Yeast, the microorganism that creates alcohol, can't digest raw starch. The starch molecules are too big and complex. They need to be broken down into simple sugars first. In the modern world, brewers do this through malting, a process of tricking grain into sprouting which releases the necessary enzymes. The Wari had a different and far more personal solution. One of the most powerful sources of the starch-busting enzyme amylase is human saliva. You watch as the women take handfuls of dry maize flour, place it in their mouths, and chew. They work the dry flour with their saliva until it forms a small, dense cake. Then they spit this cake directly into the brewing vat with the Molle water. Yes, you heard that right. The secret ingredient, the catalyst for the whole process, was spit. It's a beautifully efficient bit of human biochemistry, using the body itself as a piece of brewing equipment. It might sound a bit off-putting to us, and it's probably best not to think about it the next time a craft brewer gets pretentious about their unique house culture. For the Wari, this was simply part of a sacred and essential process, infusing the brew not just with enzymes but with a human essence. Once the chewed maize and the Molle water are combined, the mixture is slowly heated over the fire. It's brought to a boil, which serves to sterilize the liquid, killing any unwanted bacteria and to ensure all the sugars and flavors are fully dissolved. After boiling, the huge vats are moved off the fire and left to cool in the open air. And then, another kind of magic begins. Wild yeasts, floating invisibly on the Andean breeze, land on the surface of the sweet liquid and begin to feast. The brew comes alive, bubbling gently as the yeast consumes the sugars and releases carbon dioxide and alcohol. It's a quiet, living process, the whole courtyard now filled with the gentle hiss of fermentation and a heady, fruity, alcoholic aroma. After several days, the bubbling subsides. The chicha is ready. It's not the clear, filtered beverage you might be used to. This is a cloudy, substantial drink, full of nutrients and suspended solids. It was as much a food as it was a beverage, a vital source of calories and vitamins. And the color is stunning. Thanks to the skins of the berries, the finished chicha de Molle has a distinctive, hazy, pinkish red color. It was basically the ancient world's first major rosé wave. Can you imagine the spectacle? A vast plaza filled with thousands of nobles and citizens, all drinking this vibrant, glowing pink liquid from brightly painted cups. It was a feast for the eyes as well as the spirit. But was this exact recipe used everywhere, for every occasion? Historians still argue whether this brewing process was a rigidly controlled, state-mandated recipe, or if it allowed for significant local variation. On one hand, a standardized product would make sense for a state-run operation. A consistent Wari official chicha would be a reliable brand, a taste of the empire that was the same in the capital as it was in a distant outpost. On the other hand, the Andes is a place of immense local diversity. It's likely that provincial brewers incorporated their own local traditions and ingredients, perhaps using different fruits or grains for everyday chicha, and reserving the prestigious, labor-intensive Molle and maize recipe for the most important state-sponsored events. The vats are full now, bubbling with potential. This pink, potent liquid is ready. But this small village-scale operation isn't enough to power an empire. To do that, you need to scale up. You need a dedicated, industrial-strength facility. That communal brewery in the village courtyard is producing a vital, culturally significant beverage. But it's not enough. It's not enough to fuel the labor of thousands of workers, to host diplomatic summits with foreign dignitaries, or to supply an entire province with the liquid currency of the state. To do that, the Wari needed to think bigger. They needed to move from craft brewing to industrial production. To see what that looks like, you have to travel. You leave the Wari heartland in Ayacucho and join a llama caravan heading south. For weeks, you walk. You travel along the paved stone roads the Wari engineered, a network that stitches their vertical archipelago together. The landscape shifts around you. You descend from the high, grassy Puna, down through the terraced agricultural valleys, and into the increasingly arid foothills of the Andes. The air gets thicker, but also drier. The sun feels hotter, more direct. Cacti begin to replace the hardy mountain shrubs. You are heading towards the southern frontier of the empire, a journey of several hundred miles. Finally, you enter the Moquegua Valley. This is a different world from the highlands. It's a true desert. Vast, sandy plains stretch out, shimmering in the heat. The mountains here are stark and barren, colossal piles of red and brown rock. Cutting through this desolation is a slash of impossible green. The river valley itself. a narrow corridor of life made possible by water flowing down from the distant peaks. This is a frontier, a place of tension and opportunity, and it is here, dominating the entire landscape, that you see it. It's a mountain, but unlike any you've seen before. It doesn't rise to a peak. Instead, it erupts from the valley floor in sheer vertical cliffs, climbing over 1,000 feet straight into the sky, where it is abruptly sliced off, leaving a top that is unnaturally flat. It's a geological formation known as a mesa, and it looks like a giant stone anvil left behind by the gods. This is Cerro Baul. The name given to it by the Spanish centuries later means trunk mountain or chest mountain because its shape resembles a massive storage box. It's a fitting name. The Wari used this place as a repository, a strongbox for their power on this volatile frontier. Its location is no accident. This valley was a critical buffer zone. Just to the south, a few days' walk away, lay the northernmost territory of the Wari's great rivals, the Tiwanaku Empire. These two powers, Wari and Tiwanaku, were the superpowers of the Andes for centuries, locked in a delicate dance of competition, influence, and avoidance. Cerro Baul was the Wari's statement piece on this southern border, a permanent and highly visible projection of their presence. It's so perfectly, dramatically defensible that it's hard not to see it as a fortress. The sheer cliffs make a frontal assault almost suicidal. Any attacker would be forced up one of a few narrow, winding pathways, completely exposed to defenders above. You'd have to be a pretty determined or foolish enemy to even try. It practically screams, "Keep out." But was it just a military base? This is where the story gets more complex. Historians still argue whether Cerro Baul was primarily a heavily armed military fortress, a sacred ceremonial center, or a sophisticated diplomatic outpost. The evidence is tantalizingly ambiguous. Its defensive nature points to a military garrison, a kind of Andean checkpoint Charlie staring down the Tiwanaku. Yet, its dramatic placement, an altar suspended between earth and sky, also makes it a perfect stage for religious ceremony. A place to perform rituals that would be visible for miles around, impressing both the gods and the local, non-Wari peoples who inhabited this valley. It could have been a great pilgrimage site, a cathedral on the frontier. The third possibility is perhaps the most compelling. Maybe it wasn't about keeping people out, but about inviting specific people in. Cerro Baul could have been a grand diplomatic and economic enclave, a place where the Wari could host local leaders, showering them with prestige goods and, of course, feasts, in order to peacefully incorporate them into the Wari Empire. It was less a fortress and more of a permanent embassy with an attached cultural center and a really good open bar. The truth, most likely, is that it was all three at once. The Wari were nothing if not efficient. Cerro Baul was a masterpiece of multi-purpose infrastructure, simultaneously projecting military strength, religious authority, and the irresistible allure of political generosity. You begin your ascent. The path is steep, switchbacking up the side of the cliff. The river valley shrinks below you into a thin green line. The wind whips around you, carrying the scent of dust and dry earth. As you near the top, the path levels out, passing through a heavily fortified gateway. You step through it and onto the summit. The space opens up into a sprawling complex of buildings, palaces, temples, plazas, and storehouses. But it is the scent on the air that stops you. It's that familiar smell of fermentation, but magnified 100 times. You have arrived. You are standing on top of a mountain that the Wari transformed into the largest, most sophisticated brewery in the ancient Americas. You step past the gateway and onto the summit proper, and the sheer scale of the operation before you is breathtaking. That communal village brewery, with its handful of large jars and convivial atmosphere, was a community bake sale. This is an industrial bakery. This is state-level production. The brewery complex at Cerro Baul is not a single room or a courtyard. It's a sprawling, multi-room facility, a dedicated factory for producing the fuel of the Wari state. You are walking through an ancient assembly line designed for the efficient creation of chicha on a massive scale. Your first stop is the milling room. The floor is lined with large, saddle-shaped grinding stones made from heavy vesicular basalt. These are the batanis, Resting on top of them are their partners, smaller, crescent-shaped rocking stones called tunancas. This is where the maize, the starchy heart of the brew, was processed. You can almost hear the ghosts of the past at work, the rhythmic scraping sound of stone on stone, a sound that would have been the daily percussion of this place. You imagine women kneeling here for hours, rocking the heavy stones back and forth, turning hard kernels of corn into the fine flour needed for the mash. It was grueling, physical labor, the first essential step in the production chain. From the milling room, you move into the heart of the brewery, the boiling hall. The temperature immediately rises, the air thick with imaginary steam. Here you see the remains of multiple stone-lined hearths, carefully constructed to hold the immense weight of the brewing vessels and to concentrate the heat of the fires. And the vessels themselves are monumental. While some are broken, their thick ceramic shards hinting at their former glory, others were found by archaeologists almost fully intact. These aren't just large pots, they are colossal vats, capable of holding hundreds of liters each. Archaeologists have calculated that the brewers here could produce over 1,000 liters, that is more than 260 gallons, of chicha in a single coordinated batch. To put that in perspective, a standard American beer keg holds about 15 gallons. This single facility could produce the equivalent of 17 kegs of potent, sacred beer at once. This wasn't for a casual get-together. This was for supplying an institution. Next, you enter the fermentation hall. It's a quieter, cooler space. Here, rows of even larger ceramic jars were set, many of them partially buried in the floor. This clever bit of engineering used the earth itself as a natural insulator, helping to maintain the stable, cool temperature that is ideal for a slow, controlled fermentation. You can picture this room in its prime. Dozens of these huge ceramic wombs, each filled with the cooling wort, quietly bubbling as microscopic yeast went about its transformative work. The air would have been filled with that sweet, intoxicating aroma of active fermentation, the smell of power being brewed. As you wander through these carefully excavated rooms, you notice something fascinating on the floor. The dust and dirt are full of the tiny, desiccated seeds and skins of molle berries. The archaeological record is saturated with them here, in the brewery and in the great feasting plazas nearby. But then, you take a walk to the other side of the mountaintop, to the areas identified as the living quarters, the domestic spaces where the people who ran this facility actually lived, and the molle berries vanish. They aren't in the family kitchens or the household trash pits. This tiny detail tells a huge story. Chicha de mole, the pink, peppery, sacred brew, was not the everyday drink of the people of Cerro Baúl. It was a state-produced, high-status beverage reserved for special occasions. It was for political feasts, for religious ceremonies, for diplomacy. For their daily thirst, the residents likely drank a simpler, plain maize chicha. This is the difference between the cheap table wine you have with dinner and the vintage champagne a government breaks out for a state visit. Molle was the drink of politics. This raises an important question. Who were the highly skilled individuals entrusted with brewing this political liquid? Who were the brewmasters of Cerro Baúl? Historians still argue whether the women brewing here were elite Wari priestesses or noble women, sent from the capital as bearers of a sacred state recipe, or if they were local women, conscripted and trained in the Wari way. If they were elites from the heartland, it would suggest that brewing was a sacred art, a state secret jealously guarded by the ruling class. Bringing their own brewers would be a way to guarantee a consistent, high-quality product that met ritual standards. On the other hand, training local women would have been a brilliant act of political integration, giving the local community a vital, high-status role in the functioning of this imperial center. It is the ancient equivalent of a corporation deciding whether to fly in its own expensive managers from headquarters, or to invest in training and promoting local talent. Either way, standing here amidst the ruins of their industrial-scale brewery, you can't help but be impressed. This was a logistical masterpiece. Every detail, from the specialized rooms to the semi-subterranean fermentation jars, points to a deep, practical understanding of the brewing process. The Wari didn't just make beer, they systematized its production on a scale that allowed them to literally manufacture social cohesion. Now that we've seen the factory, it's time to see how the product was used. We've toured the factory and we've seen the impressive production numbers. But 1,000 liters of chicha, sitting in jars on a mountaintop, is just 1,000 liters of chicha. It holds no inherent power. Its power is only activated when it is deployed, when it is poured and consumed in a very specific context. So standing here on Cerro Baul, looking out from the silent ruins of the brewery towards the vast empty plazas, you have to ask, what was the business model? How do you convert a fermented beverage into political allegiance and organized labor? The answer lies in a uniquely Andean understanding of how human societies work. Forget everything you know about market economies. Forget currency, contracts, wages, and prices. The Wari world, like most of the pre-Columbian Americas, didn't run on money. It ran on relationships. The foundational principle of this world was reciprocity. At the village level, this system, often known by the later Quechua term Aini, was a beautiful expression of mutual support. If I help you harvest your potatoes, you are bound by an unbreakable social rule to help me roof my house next month. It's a system of give and take, a web of obligations that holds the community together and ensures everyone survives. It's banking on favors, not cash. What the Wari elite did with breathtaking genius was to take this intimate village-level system of reciprocity and scale it up to the level of the state. They weaponized generosity. Think about it. As a farmer, you can reciprocate with your neighbor on equal terms. You both have roughly the same resources, but you cannot reciprocate on equal terms with the state. When a Wari lord acting as the agent of the state invites you and 1,000 other people to a feast, the dynamic shifts completely. He provides a mountain of roasted llama and guinea pig, piles of potatoes and quinoa, and most importantly, an endless river of that high-status pink chicha from the state-run brewery. He is demonstrating a capacity for abundance that is godlike, something you could never hope to match. You, the guest, eat his food and drink his chicha. You are participating in his generosity, and by doing so, you are entering into that same ancient contract of reciprocity. But how can you possibly pay him back? You can't throw him a feast of equal magnificence. You don't have the resources. You can't give him a gift of equal value. The only thing of value you possess that the state requires is your time and your strength, your labor. By accepting a cup of chicha, you are acknowledging a debt that you will be asked to repay later, when the state needs a new road paved, a canal dug, or a temple built. It's a brilliant, almost invisible form of taxation. It's not a demand for money, which can be resented. It's a social obligation created willingly by the act of attending a party. This transaction was reinforced by the deep cultural meaning of sharing food and drink. In the Andes, to eat with someone was to affirm a social bond. To accept a drink from your host's cup was to become, in a symbolic sense, their kin. It was an act of trust and affiliation. This made the dynamic at these feasts incredibly potent. When a Wari lord offered you chicha, he wasn't just offering you a drink. He was offering you membership in the Wari political family, with all the benefits and obligations that entailed. To refuse that drink would be a shocking breach of etiquette. It would be a public rejection of his authority, a deeply political act of defiance. You couldn't just politely decline and say you were the designated llama driver. This was not a casual affair. It was a high-stakes performance of allegiance. This leads to a central question that still animates the field. Historians still argue whether these state-sponsored feasts were genuinely festive occasions that fostered a sense of shared identity and community, or if they were carefully staged, coercive political performances where attendance was non-negotiable. Was it a real party, or was it a mandatory company meeting with an open bar? On one side, the feasts undoubtedly provided a huge nutritional boon to the attendees and a welcome break from daily toil. The sense of community and shared purpose could have been entirely genuine. But on the other side, it's hard to ignore the element of political pressure. Local leaders would be expected to show up with their people, and everyone would be watching to see who drank with the most enthusiasm. The generosity was real, but it was also calculated. It was likely both. A genuinely enjoyable event that also functioned as a powerful and subtly coercive political instrument. It's a perfect feedback loop. The state organizes labor to create agricultural surplus. That surplus is used to produce massive quantities of chicha. The chicha is served at feasts that display the state's power and create social debt. That debt is then repaid with labor, which creates more surplus. It is a self-perpetuating engine of empire, and at its heart is the simple, powerful act of sharing a drink. Now that you understand the theory, it's time to see it in practice. The invitations have been sent. The vats at Cerro Baul are full. You're about to be a guest at a Wari state feast. The day arrives bright and clear. The sun on the summit of Cerro Baul has a piercing intensity, and the wind carries a current of palpable anticipation. You make your way to the central plaza, a vast, open space paved with stone, and it is already teeming with life. This is the stage for the political theater, and you are part of the cast. Hundreds of people are gathered here. You see the Wari officials, confident and composed in their magnificent tunics, the geometric patterns and divine figures marking them as the hosts and masters of this domain. Standing in smaller, more cautious groups are the local dignitaries, leaders of the non-Wari peoples who live in this valley. They too are in their finest dress, their own local styles, a vibrant contrast to the standardized aesthetic of the Wari. It is a visual representation of the event itself, an encounter between imperial power and local identity. The sounds are overwhelming at first. This is not a quiet, solemn ceremony, it's a full-blown sensory experience. Above the hum of hundreds of conversations in a dozen different dialects, you hear music. A troupe of musicians is playing, their breathy notes from sets of panpipes, antaras, creating a hypnotic, cascading melody. Beneath this, the deep, resonant pulse of skin drums provides a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm that seems to vibrate right through the stone floor and up into your chest. The music is constant, an auditory landscape that shapes the mood of the entire event, moving from stately and processional to lively and celebratory as the day wears on. Then, the smells hit you. The entire plaza is an open-air kitchen. Wood smoke stings your eyes slightly, but it's laden with the irresistible aroma of roasting meat. Over long, shallow fire pits, whole llamas and alpacas are being slow roasted. You see smaller creatures too, guinea pigs or kai, skewered and cooking to a crisp, their skin crackling over the coals. This isn't just a token meal. This is a demonstration of almost reckless abundance. The sheer quantity of protein on display is a powerful statement in a world where meat was a rare luxury for most people. Alongside the meat, you smell the earthy scent of potatoes and other tubers baking in pit ovens, and the nutty aroma of boiling quinoa, a staple grain of the Andes. As the sun climbs higher, the feast begins. There are no tables and chairs, no formal place settings. This is a grand, standing affair. Servants move through the crowd with massive platters laden with food. You're handed a piece of tender, smoky llama meat, so rich it melts in your mouth. You try the crispy guinea pig, a beloved Andean delicacy. There are bowls of hearty stew, piles of potatoes of all shapes and colors. You eat with your hands, sharing in the communal bounty. And then comes the main event. A procession of high-status women, perhaps the noble brewers you imagined earlier, emerges from the brewery complex. They carry enormous, beautifully painted ceramic jars, each holding many gallons of the precious pink chicha. They move gracefully through the plaza, their presence commanding respect. One of them stops before you, smiles, and tilts her jar, filling the cup you've been given. The liquid is a hazy, rosy color, with a light, frothy head. You take a sip. It's cool and refreshing, slightly tart like a sour beer, but with an underlying sweetness and that distinct, spicy, peppery finish from the molle berries. It's surprisingly complex, and you can feel the warmth of its potency spread through you almost immediately. You look around the plaza as you drink, trying to read the social map of the event. Where is everyone standing? Is there a VIP section? Historians still argue whether the layout of these feasts was a rigid map of the social hierarchy or a more fluid communal affair. Perhaps the Wari governor and his entourage are on a raised terrace, looking down upon the proceedings, a clear architectural expression of their superior status. The most important guests, the most powerful local chiefs, might be invited to stand on a slightly lower tier, closer to the hosts while the common folk fill the main plaza below. But it's also possible that there were no such physical divisions. The Wari hosts might be walking among the crowd, fostering a sense of unity and direct connection, mingling with everyone. In that model, status isn't determined by where you stand, but by what you hold in your hand. As your cup is refilled and then refilled again, the initial formality of the event begins to dissolve. The music gets faster. Spontaneous dancing breaks out in pockets of the plaza. The hum of conversation grows into a boisterous roar of laughter and talk. It begins to feel like a genuine party, a true celebration. It's easy to forget the political calculation behind it all, to get lost in the moment. It's a bit like an office holiday party after the boss has made his speech and the serious drinking has begun. But the hosts are not lost in the moment. They are observing, engaging, measuring the success of their investment. Every shared joke, every toast, every cup of chicha accepted and drained is another thread in the social fabric they are weaving. The contract is being signed, not with a pen, but with every sip you take. The chicha warms you, the music energizes you, and the sheer spectacle of the feast is intoxicating. With every sip you take from your cup, the complex social and political contract of the Wari world is being reinforced. But the magic isn't just in the liquid. It's in the vessel that carries it. You're not drinking from a rough clay mug or a simple gourd. Look down at the object in your hands. You are holding a piece of carefully crafted political technology. You're holding a caro. This is the classic Andean drinking vessel, a form perfected and mass-produced by the Wari. It has a distinctive, elegant shape, a beaker broad at the lip that flares outwards before gracefully tapering down to a flat, solid base. It has no handle. It's designed to be cradled in one or both hands, a form that encourages a more mindful, deliberate act of drinking. The one in your hand is made of ceramic, expertly thrown and fired, its surface polished to a satisfying smoothness. But caros were made from various materials that reflected the status of the owner, while yours is pottery. A high lord might drink from one carved from a single piece of hardwood, and the emperor himself might have possessed a caro hammered from silver or gold. But it's the surface of the caro that is the true messenger. Like the tunics of the elite, the caro is a canvas for the state's symbolic language. Your cup is covered in intricate paintings. You turn it in your hands and recognize the figures we saw before in the textiles. There is the imposing, front-facing staff god, staring out with huge, omniscient eyes. Flanking him are his attendants, the winged, feline-headed figures running in profile. The artwork is executed in a palette of deep reds, creamy whites, and stark blacks, a bold and instantly recognizable style. These are not just decorations, they are declarations. Each caro is a portable monument, a miniature piece of propaganda that reiterates the cosmic order and the Wari's central place within it. You glance over at the Wari governor, your host. You notice the caro he is drinking from is of a peculiar design. While some cups depict gods and animals, his is decorated with a wide, complex band of geometric, interlocking patterns that wraps around the vessel's waist. An archaeologist standing beside you whispers a fascinating tidbit in your ear. This decorative band is believed to be a direct representation of the ornate, woven sash or belt from a Wari noble's tunic. The caro itself is dressed in the official regalia of the Wari elite. It's a brilliantly subtle piece of symbolism. When the host offers a drink from a cup like this, he is offering a drink from a vessel that is an effigy of his own power and status. The authority of the state is literally embodied in the cup. You are drinking from a ceramic official, a tiny clay ambassador of the empire. Not all the cups are so literal, however. Many of the caros being passed around the plaza are covered not in figures but in these highly abstract geometric designs. They are beautiful, a mesmerizing dance of lines, steps, and frets. But what do they mean? Are they just pretty patterns? This is a point of intense scholarly interest. Historians still argue whether these abstract designs are purely decorative, a way of showing off artistic skill, or if they constitute a kind of graphic code that we have simply lost the key to. On one side of the debate, the patterns are seen as aesthetically pleasing filler, the Andean equivalent of paisley or plaid. But a more tantalizing theory suggests that these patterns are anything but random. This school of thought proposes that the designs are a form of non-figurative communication, a symbolic system deeply linked to the information-rich patterns woven into textiles. Perhaps a certain combination of step frets and diamonds signifies a particular lineage, or a specific administrative district, or even a concept like reciprocity or divine power. If this is true, then we are looking at a lost language hiding in plain sight. We see an attractive design. A Wari guest might have read a sentence. Whatever the meaning of the specific designs, the function of the kero in this feast is clear. It is an instrument of indoctrination. As you lift the cup to drink, the painted images are the last thing you see before the chicha touches your lips. You tip it back and the staff god seems to pour his divine essence out with the beer. It's a powerful multi-sensory form of messaging, far more effective than a political pamphlet, especially when paired with a mind-altering beverage. Now multiply that experience by 1,000. Every guest in this plaza is holding a piece of the same ideological puzzle. The shared art on the keros creates a powerful visual unity, reminding everyone that they are part of the same grand, Wari-centric cosmos. But as you're about to find out, while the ideology might be shared, the cups, and the people holding them, are not all created equal. You look more closely at the kero in your own hands. It's a fine piece of work. The paint is crisp, the shape is pleasing. You feel a certain pride in being given such a well-made vessel. But then you start to look around. You notice that the important-looking local chief standing near the Wari governor is holding a kero that is similar in style to yours, but it's noticeably larger, and the governor himself holds a cup that is larger still, and so finely polished it seems to glow. Then you look over towards the edge of the plaza, where the lower-ranking attendees are gathered. Their cups are much smaller, simpler, with minimal decoration or even just plain unpainted ceramic. And in that moment, the entire social structure of the feast snaps into sharp, brilliant focus. In the Wari world, you are what you drink from. The specific kero you were handed upon entering this plaza was not a random choice. It was a calculated statement that broadcast your exact social standing to anyone with eyes to see. The size, the material, the quality of the finish, and the complexity of the painted design all corresponded to a precise rung on the social ladder. A large, ornate kero signified a person of great importance. A small, simple one signified a commoner. It was a brilliant and brutally efficient system for managing a large, diverse crowd. There was no need for name tags or formal introductions. Your cup did all the talking. It's the ancient Andean equivalent of a modern event where some people get a VIP pass with access to the champagne room, and others get a paper wristband for the cash bar. Your cup told you, and everyone else, exactly where you belonged. As you're contemplating this, you witness a fascinating interaction. The Wari governor gestures for an attendant, who comes forward bearing not one but 2 keros on a woven tray. The 2 cups are a perfectly matched set, identical in size, material, and their intricate geometric decoration. They are twins, carved from the same thought if not the same piece of wood. The governor approaches a visiting dignitary, a powerful chief from a neighboring non-Wari group. The governor takes one kero, the chief is given the other. They are filled from the same ceremonial jar. They lock eyes, raise the vessels in a silent toast, and drink in unison. This is not just a polite gesture. It is the ultimate performance of political reciprocity. The use of identical paired keros was a powerful symbol reserved for interactions between equals. It was a non-verbal way of saying, we are peers, we are partners. The relationship between us is balanced and symmetrical. It was a miniature treaty, a pact of mutual respect enacted through the medium of chicha. You can imagine the inverse too. When that same governor turns to a lesser subordinate local leader, he might offer him a drink, but the cups would be mismatched. The governor's would be large and ornate, the subordinates smaller and simpler. The message is just as clear. I am the patron, you are the client. This relationship is not one of equals. This intricate dance of cups leads to a deeper question about power and social mobility. Historians still argue whether a kero simply reflected your existing status, or if the Wari lords could use the presentation of a kero to actively create or alter your status on the spot. Was the cup a mirror or a catalyst? One view holds that the system was rigid. Your rank was predetermined and you were given the kero that matched. You're a provincial administrator. You get the Mark III Provincial Administrator Cup. End of story. But another more dynamic theory suggests that the Wari could play the system. Imagine a local leader of middling importance who has shown exceptional loyalty. In a dramatic public gesture, the Wari governor might personally hand him a kero of a size and quality far above his station. This act would be a form of public promotion, a field commission in the Wari imperial system. Everyone would see it. The message would be unmistakable. This man is now in my favor. He is more important than he was yesterday. Afford him the respect that this fine cup now demands. It's a brilliant way to reward allies and sow ambition among the ranks, all without saying a word. It is like being at a massive corporate dinner and suddenly finding out the CEO has moved you to the head table. Your status has just visibly leveled up, so you look down at your own cup again, this time with a new understanding. It's a solid, mid-tier model. Good quality ceramic, well painted, a respectable size. It tells you that you are a welcome guest, a person of some note, worthy of the good chicha and a cup to match. But you are not in the inner circle. You are not a peer of the governor. The cup has placed you, defined you, and you accepted it without a second thought. The feast is roaring on, the music is playing, but the real work is already done. The hierarchies have been established and affirmed. The generosity has been displayed and accepted. And now, as the sun begins to set, a different kind of thought begins to settle in. The party has been great, but the bill is coming due. The last notes of the panpipes fade as the sun dips below the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. The feast is over. You walk back from the plaza, your head light from the chicha, your belly full of roasted llama. A deep sense of satisfaction and community washes over you. It was a magnificent day, a display of power and generosity you will speak of for years. The Wari state is a good patron, a worthy lord. But as the pleasant haze of the alcohol begins to wear off, another feeling starts to creep in, a feeling of weight. You accepted the food. You drank the chicha. You hold the beautifully painted kero in your hand, a souvenir of the day. You have taken a gift, and in the moral universe of the Andes, a gift must always be repaid. The bill for this party is now due. That debt will not be paid in coin or tribute goods. It will be paid in the one resource the state needs above all others: your time, your energy, your labor. This is not a casual or haphazard arrangement. It is a highly organized state-level institution, a system that the Inca would later become famous for, but which the Wari likely perfected. It is the mita. The word comes from the later Quechua language and means a turn or a season, and that's exactly what it was. It was a rotational labor draft. Under this system, every community within the Wari sphere of influence was required to send a percentage of its able-bodied population to work on state projects for a set period of time each year. This was not slavery. You were not owned by the state. You were fulfilling a temporary mandatory public service obligation. When your turn was up, you would return to your village, your family, and your own fields. Next year, it would be your neighbor's turn. It was this system that built the Wari world. The grand administrative centers, the agricultural terraces that climbed the mountains like stairways for giants, the thousands of miles of paved roads, this very fortress of Kero Baul, none of it was built by a paid workforce. It was all built by the temporary hands of thousands of people, all paying their social debt to the state. The feast then was the moral and political justification for the draft. It's a bit of a psychological masterstroke, isn't it? You're not being conscripted. You're simply holding up your end of a sacred bargain. It reframes the entire transaction from coercion to reciprocity. Remember that incredible feast we threw for you? The endless beer, the mountain of food? Well, this new irrigation canal isn't going to dig itself. And here is where the Wari genius for social engineering truly shines. The state's generosity did not end when the feast was over. It extended to the work site itself. You show up for your mita assignment, let's say to help build a new temple. You might be expecting months of grim, silent, back-breaking toil, but the atmosphere you find is startlingly familiar. A group of musicians stands to the side playing the same rhythmic tunes you heard at the feast. A temporary kitchen has been set up and the smell of cooking food fills the air. And sure enough, several times a day, attendants come around with large jars of chicha to refresh the workers. The Wari understood human psychology. They knew that demanding labor is one thing, but hosting it is another. By providing food, drink, and music, they transformed a period of arduous construction into a long-form, state-sponsored communal event. The work was still incredibly hard, of course, but it was set within a social context of festivity and state provision. It's the ultimate application of whistle while you work, but with a steady supply of beer to keep morale high. Productivity would have soared, and the project itself would become a source of collective pride rather than collective resentment. But was it really such a happy arrangement? Historians still argue whether the Wari Mita was a largely voluntary and equitable system rooted in traditional reciprocity, or a coercive institution that drained communities of their most productive members. On the one hand, it's possible that communities participated willingly, seeing it as their civic duty, and a fair exchange for the security and stability the Wari state provided. The festive atmosphere of the labor itself might have made it a genuinely positive social experience. On the other hand, it's easy to see a darker side. Local leaders would have been under immense pressure to meet their labor quotas. The work on state projects was often dangerous. While the state provided for you during your service, your absence back home put a strain on your family and community. The Spanish would later adopt and warp the Mita system for their silver mines, turning it into a truly horrific instrument of death and exploitation. And it's hard not to let that later tragedy color our view of its Wari predecessor. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. It was a system of obligation that could be both beneficial and burdensome. But one thing is certain. The feast and the Mita were two sides of the same imperial coin. One was the grand party, the other was the grand project. The chicha you drank was not free. Its price was a season of your life, spent quarrying stone, paving roads, or digging canals, all in the service of the state that had so generously hosted you. The social debt has been called in, the labor force has been mustered, and the work is fueled by the same chicha that created the obligation in the first place. So, what does this massive, mobilized workforce, this human dividend from the state's investment in feasting, actually build? You leave the feasting plaza of Cerro Baul and travel again, this time to a construction site in a broad, fertile valley. Here you see the Wari state not just as a political entity, but as a physical force of creation. Before you, a new city is rising from the dusty earth. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of Mita laborers are at work. They are a diverse crowd, drawn from different villages and ethnic groups across the province, each speaking their own dialect. Yet they work in unison, directed by Wari architects and overseers. The air is filled with the rhythmic clang of stone hammers, the shouts of foremen, and the ever-present hypnotic pulse of drums and panpipes. This isn't a grim construction gang. It's a massive state-organized project with the same festive undertones as the work parties and the feasts. This is how the great Wari administrative centers were born. Sites like the famous Piquilacta, near the eventual Inca capital of Cusco, were monumental undertakings. When you stand in the ruins of Piquilacta today, the first thing that strikes you is the sheer obsessive order of it all. It's a colossal rectangle, nearly 2 square miles of territory, enclosed by immense stone walls that in some places reached 40 feet high. Inside these walls, the city is laid out in a rigid, almost fanatical grid. Long, narrow buildings are arranged in blocks, separated by corridors that run at perfect right angles. It is a city designed with a ruler, not grown from a village. This architectural style tells you so much about the Wari mindset. They were obsessed with this kind of orthogonal, planned layout. They would arrive in a new territory and impose this geometric vision onto the landscape, often with little regard for the natural topography. If a hill was in the way of their perfect grid, they would build massive retaining walls and terraces to make it conform. It was a powerful physical statement of their worldview, the triumph of rational, centralized order over the chaotic, unpredictable world of nature. It's the architectural equivalent of their standardized pottery. It's like they invented the concept of the master-planned community and decided to roll it out across the Andes. Every new Wari center was a declaration in stone that said, "Order has arrived." Our order. But what exactly were these places for? You walk the empty corridors of the half-finished city. The scale is impressive, but the buildings themselves are strangely uniform, even monotonous. Many seem to lack the features of a normal home, like individual hearths or varied room sizes. This has led to a fascinating debate. Historians still argue whether these colossal centers like Piquilacta were true, bustling cities, or something else entirely. Were they permanently inhabited provincial capitals, filled with administrators, soldiers, and artisans? Or were they vast ceremonial empty stages, built to be occupied only periodically? Perhaps they were primarily giant fairgrounds, designed to host the massive feasts and religious ceremonies that were the bedrock of Wari power. For most of the year, they might have stood largely empty, a silent testament to Wari might maintained by a skeleton crew, only to roar to life when the regional population was gathered to pay their labor tax and receive the state's generosity. It's a bit like a modern sports stadium, a huge, expensive piece of infrastructure that is only used to its full capacity a few dozen times a year. A third, even more minimalist theory, suggests they were primarily architectural billboards. The main point wasn't to live in them, but simply to build them. The act of construction kept the Mita workforce busy, and the finished imposing product served as a permanent, unmissable symbol of imperial power, a way to dominate a region with a relatively small number of actual Wari personnel. Whatever their precise function, these centers were just one part of the Wari infrastructure program. That same Chicha-fueled labor force was also expanding and paving the great Andean road system, a network that was the circulatory system of the empire, allowing for the movement of armies, administrators, and goods. They were digging immense irrigation canals, turning dry plains into fertile farmland, which in turn generated more agricultural surplus to create, you guessed it, more chicha. It was all one interconnected system of development, designed to reinforce the state's power and productivity. You watch as a team of laborers, working together, levers a massive multi-ton stone lintel into place above a gateway. They chant in unison to coordinate their efforts. Once the stone is settled, an overseer gives a signal, and an attendant comes forward with a clay jar, pouring cups of chicha for the team. They drink deeply, wipe their mouths, and turn to the next stone. This is it. This is the whole system in a single snapshot. The goodwill generated at the feast, transmuted into organized labor, is now being solidified into the permanent architecture of empire. Every stone in these walls was purchased with a drink. So far, though, we've focused on the male actors in this drama, the lords who host, the men who work, but we've overlooked the people who controlled the most critical step in the entire process. Who was making the beer? That question hangs in the dusty air of the construction site. Who was making the beer? We've seen the feasting lords and the laboring masses, both overwhelmingly male spheres of action. It's easy to imagine the entire Wari enterprise as a world run by and for men, but that would be a profound misunderstanding. To find the true engine room of this political factory, we have to shift our focus. The power behind the throne, or in this case, behind the feasting plaza, was held by women. Across the Andes for thousands of years, the art and science of brewing chicha was the exclusive domain of women. It was a domestic skill, yes, but it was also a sacred and highly respected one, a body of knowledge passed from mother to daughter. When the Wari state decided to scale up chicha production from a household craft to an industrial process, they didn't upend this tradition. They leaned into it. They didn't replace the female brewers. They elevated them. The production of the state's most vital political and ritual commodity could not be left to just anyone. It was entrusted to high-status women, priestesses and noblewomen who had the lineage, the ritual purity, and the specialized knowledge to create a brew worthy of the gods and the state. Let's return to that mountaintop brewery at Cerro Baul. See it now not as a factory of anonymous workers, but as the domain of a powerful sisterhood of brew mistresses. You see a woman, her hair intricately braided, her tunic made of the finest, most colorful weave. She's not grinding the maize herself. She is directing others. She moves with an air of authority, dipping a tasting spoon into a bubbling fermentation vat. Her expression is focused as a modern chemist analyzing a sample. She is a manager, a scientist, and a ritual specialist all in one. Her palate, her knowledge of fermentation times, her understanding of the sacred protocols. This expertise is an essential pillar of the state. The male lords in the plaza below can make all the political speeches they want, but they are utterly dependent on her skill to produce the substance that makes their politics possible. In a world without written recipes, her knowledge is the entire franchise. It's like being the only person at the royal court who knows the king's top-secret barbecue sauce recipe. How can we be so sure that these women held such an elevated status? The dead, as always, tell the most vivid stories. Archaeologists have unearthed the tombs of women at Wari sites that paint a clear picture of power and prestige. Imagine a burial chamber, deep beneath the floor of a high-status residence. Inside, a woman is laid to rest, wrapped in layers of exquisite textiles. Around her are the markers of her rank, a finely crafted shawl pin or tupu, made of hammered silver, a necklace of imported blood-red spondylus shell, a substance more precious than gold, and a set of beautifully painted ceramics. But among these symbols of generic elite status are other, more specific items. Placed near her hands is a personal kero, a cup of exceptional quality. Near her feet is a miniature, perfectly formed ceramic brewing vat, a symbolic tool of her trade. She is buried with both her wealth and her work. This combination is the archaeological smoking gun. It tells us, unequivocally, that her role as a master brewer was not a lowly service profession, but the very source of her elite identity. She wasn't a servant to the elite, she was the elite. This, of course, raises a classic question in the study of gender and power. Historians still argue whether these elite brewers were powerful figures in their own right, or if their status was merely a reflection of their connection to powerful men. Was their power independent or derived? One side of the argument holds that their exclusive control over chicha production, the literal means of production for political capital, gave them immense, direct leverage. They were the indispensable technocrats in the Wari machine, and this position gave them a real voice and genuine authority. The other view suggests that their status came first from their lineage. They were the wives, daughters, and sisters of the male ruling class, and they were entrusted with this vital role because they were already high status. Their power, in this model, was derived from their male relatives, making them influential but ultimately dependent figures. It's the age-old question of whether you're a powerful executive because of your skills, or because your dad owns the company. The reality was likely a complex blend of both. A woman from a powerful family would be given the role, but her skill and success in that role would in turn enhance both her own standing and that of her entire family. What is certain is that the seemingly male-dominated world of Wari politics was critically dependent on a class of highly skilled, high-status women. They were the gatekeepers of the sacred brew. Without their expertise, the vats at Cerro Baul would stand empty. The feasts would fall silent. The social contract would be broken. The great construction projects would grind to a halt. The entire system would collapse. The chicha they brewed was more than a social lubricant. It was also a holy substance, a key to the world of the spirits. The chicha produced by these elite women was the lifeblood of the Wari political machine, but its significance ran even deeper. This was not just a secular tool for social engineering. The pink, peppery brew was a sacred substance, a holy sacrament that mediated the relationship between the Wari and the vast, animate, and often terrifying cosmos they inhabited. Its role in politics was simply a reflection of its even more fundamental role in religion. You move away from the noise of the construction site and the feasting plaza. You are guided to a quieter, more enclosed space on Cerro Baul, a temple courtyard, open to the sky, with a large, flat-topped stone at its center. The air here is different. It's heavy with the scent of burning incense and a palpable sense of reverence. A Wari priest stands before the stone altar. His face is painted with sacred symbols, and his tunic is even more elaborate than those of the political lords, covered in esoteric designs and mythical beings. He is the intermediary between the human world and the world of the spirits. In his hands he holds a single exquisitely crafted caro, filled to the brim with chicha de mole. He begins to chant in a low rhythmic voice, addressing the unseen forces that surround you. He invokes the names of the mountain peaks, the apus that loom on the horizon, powerful sentient beings that control the weather, the water, and the fate of those who live in their shadow. He addresses Pachamama, the earth mother beneath your feet, the source of all life and fertility. He calls out to the great celestial deities, perhaps the staff god himself, whose stern face stares out from the priest's own clothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, he raises the caro. He is not going to drink. He tips the cup and pours the entire contents in a steady stream onto the sacred stone, where it pools for a moment before running into a specially carved channel that directs it into the earth. This is a libation, one of the most ancient and universal forms of religious offering. The Wari understood their world as a web of reciprocal relationships that extended far beyond human society. The gods and the landscape were not distant abstract forces. They were living, breathing entities with needs and appetites, and they too were thirsty. The chicha offering was food and drink for the divine. By pouring out the essence of the sacred Molle tree, the Wari were nourishing the gods, repaying them for the gift of a good harvest, and obligating them to provide for the people in the future. It's the same principle of reciprocity you saw in the feast, but scaled up to a cosmic level. You give the gods a drink and they give you the rain that allows you to grow the crops to make the drink. The whole universe was invited to the party. After the last drop of chicha has soaked into the earth, the priest holds the empty caro aloft. It is a masterpiece of ceramic art, an object of beauty and power. Then, in a single, shocking motion, he brings it down hard against the altar stone. The caro shatters into a dozen pieces. This is no accident. It is the culmination of the ritual. Archaeologists have found numerous offering pits at Wari sites, filled with the remains of hundreds of these intentionally sacrificed vessels. It was a termination ritual, a way of sealing the offering and permanently transferring the cup from the world of the living to the world of the spirits. The tool that had served as the bridge between worlds was itself sent across that bridge. It's the most definitive way of saying the ceremony is over, an ancient ritual mic drop. But who exactly was the primary recipient of all this reverence? Who was at the top of the divine guest list? Historians still argue whether the main focus of these offerings was the celestial gods above, the terrestrial spirits of the landscape, or the royal ancestors sitting right there beside them. Were they pouring one out for a distant creator god like the staff deity? Or was the offering for the more immediate and tangible powers of the local mountain gods, the apus, who could send a life-giving stream or a devastating landslide with equal indifference? A third compelling possibility is that the most important guests were the ancestors. The Wari, like the Inca after them, venerated their dead rulers. The mummified bodies of past kings were not considered dead and gone. They were powerful, active members of the community. They were kept in palaces, dressed in fine clothes, and brought out on litters to preside over major ceremonies. They were consulted on important matters, and they were given their share of every feast. So when the priest poured out that chicha, it may have been to honor Pachamama, but it was also to give the mummy of Emperor Wari the Great his rightful drink. It was probably a combination of all three, a complex pantheon of sky gods, earth spirits, and divine ancestors, all needing to be nourished. This sacred liquid permeated every aspect of Wari life. It was used to consecrate a new building, its floors ritually purified and fed with chicha before it could be inhabited. Priests and shamans drank it to achieve altered states of consciousness, opening their minds to commune with the spirit world. It was present at every birth, wedding, and most especially every funeral, where it was drunk by the living and offered to the dead. Chicha was the universal medium, the spiritual solvent that connected the Wari to each other, to their landscape, and to their gods. But the gods of the Wari were not the only deities in the Andes, and the Wari were not the only people vying for their favor. The cosmos the Wari inhabited was not an empty one. The gods, spirits, and ancestors they nourished with their chicha libations were part of a wider Andean pantheon, worshipped by many different peoples. And the Wari state itself was not the only major power vying for the favor of those gods and the loyalty of those people. Their entire political system, this sophisticated model of feasting and labor, was honed in the shadow of a great rival. To understand the Wari, you must also understand their neighbors, the other superpower of the age, the Tiwanaku. You travel south from the Wari outpost of Cerro Baul, leaving the desert valley and ascending once more into the highlands. The air thins and cools dramatically. The landscape opens up into a vast wind-scoured plateau, the Altiplano, over 12,000 feet above sea level. In the distance, you see a breathtaking sight, a vast inland sea of the deepest blue, shimmering under the high-altitude sun. This is Lake Titicaca, the birthplace of gods and civilizations, and on its southern shores lie the monumental ruins of the city of Tiwanaku, the capital of an empire that was Wari's contemporary, competitor, and cultural peer. The vibe here is different. The Wari built with fieldstone and plaster, creating cities of imposing scale but rough texture. The architects of Tiwanaku were masters of a different craft, a precise megalithic stonework that is almost inhuman in its perfection. You walk through their capital and are humbled by massive stone platforms, sunken temples lined with carved stone heads, and enigmatic monoliths like the Gate of the Sun, carved from a single 10-foot block of andesite. This was a civilization of immense power and antiquity, and their sphere of influence pushed up from the south, just as the Wari-as expanded from the north. The Moquegua Valley, where you attended that feast at Cerro Baul, was a contested borderland, a tense frontier between these two Andean giants. This was a geopolitical rivalry that lasted for centuries, a true Andean Cold War. But how was it fought? Was it a war of armies and garrisons or something else? Historians still argue whether the long interaction between Wari and Tiwanaku was characterized by endemic border skirmishes and military posturing, or if their competition was fought primarily in the arenas of culture, religion, and competitive hospitality. While there's little doubt that fortresses like Cerro Baul had a hard military edge, the most compelling evidence suggests that the primary battle was one of soft power. It was a war of attraction. The goal was to win the allegiance of the smaller, unaligned groups that lived in the buffer zones between them, and the primary weapon in this war was the feast. It was a Cold War of competitive charisma. The Tiwanaku also had a state religion centered on a staff god. They also built grand ceremonial centers, and they too understood that the path to political influence was through state-sponsored generosity. So you find yourself at a Tiwanaku feast. The air is filled with the sounds of their own sacred music, the smells of their own roasted meats, and of course the chicha flows. But you notice the details are different. You are handed a drinking cup, their version of a kero. It's not the Wari's elegant flared lip design. It's a straight-sided beaker, a heavy flat-bottomed tumbler. The aesthetic is different too. Instead of the Wari's busy, colorful narrative scenes, this Tiwanaku kero might be decorated with a single, stern, beautifully carved portrait of a Tiwanaku lord. Or it might be a polished blackware vessel, inlaid with shimmering turquoise. It's a more minimalist, imposing, and formal style. The Wari kero tells a story. The Tiwanaku kero presents an icon. Imagine you are a local chieftain in that contested valley. One season you are invited to Cerro Baul. You experience the vibrant, almost chaotic energy of the Wari feast. Drink their pink Molle chicha from their story-painted cups. A few months later, a delegation arrives from the south, inviting you to a Tiwanaku ceremony. Here the atmosphere is more solemn and monumental. You drink their maize or quinoa chicha from heavy, iconic beakers. You would be in the perfect position to compare, to judge. Whose gods seemed more powerful? Whose textiles were more finely woven? And perhaps most importantly, whose chicha was stronger? You would be like a food critic for competing ancient empires, and your review, expressed through your allegiance and the labor of your people, could tip the balance of power in the region. This intense competition was a powerful driver of innovation. The Wari system of feasting and labor mobilization didn't develop in a vacuum. It was likely refined and scaled up precisely because it had to be more impressive than the system of its rivals. Cerro Baul, with its industrial brewery, wasn't just a provincial supply depot. It was a statement. It was a strategic cultural and political weapon, designed to out-party and out-provide the Tiwanaku, winning the hearts, minds, and labor obligations of the local population. To successfully wage this kind of soft power war on a distant frontier, hundreds of miles from their heartland, the Wari needed an efficient and reliable logistical network. They needed a way to move not just soldiers, but supplies, prestige goods, and the all-important ingredients for a world-class feast. To wage a cold war of competitive hospitality on a frontier hundreds of miles from your capital, you need more than just a good recipe for beer. You need a first-class delivery service. An empire that runs on generosity needs an impeccable catering operation, and the Wari were master caterers. The secret to their logistical success, the physical network that held their sprawling vertical empire together, was their road system. You find yourself once again on the move, but this time, your focus is on the path beneath your feet. You are walking on a Wari road. Forget the wide, chariot-friendly highways of the Roman Empire. This is a system built for a different world, a world without wheels or beasts of burden larger than a llama. You travel on foot, in the company of a caravan of these impossibly stoic, fluffy animals, their backs laden with goods. The road itself is a marvel of practical engineering. In the flat, open country, it's a broad causeway, sometimes 15 to 20 feet across, raised slightly above the surrounding plain and marked by stone borders. In other areas, it's a simple, cleared track, but one that is always direct, always purposeful. This network, the foundation of the later and more famous Inca Empire, was the circulatory system of the Wari state, pumping resources, people, and information from the heartland to the farthest limbs of the empire. As you enter the mountains, the character of the road changes. You approach a steep ridge that seems to block your path. A road designed for wheeled vehicles would have to snake back and forth in a long series of switchbacks to manage the gradient. The Wari road does no such thing. It goes straight up. Carved directly into the bedrock of the mountain is a staircase, a flight of stone steps hundreds of feet high. This is a classic feature of Andean engineering. A staircase is an impossible obstacle for a cart or a chariot, but for a person on foot or a nimble-footed llama, it's simply the quickest way to the top. This relentless directness tells you everything you need to know about the Wari approach. Their goal was efficiency, a straight line between 2 points, and they would reshape the earth itself to achieve it. It certainly makes you think twice about complaining during your next weekend hike. How was this vast and sophisticated network created? Was it a single grand imperial vision, or something that grew more organically? As with so many things, Wari, historians still argue whether the Wari road network was a grand, centrally planned infrastructure project, like a national highway system, or if it grew more organically over time. The grand plan theory suggests that Wari leaders from their capital conceived of a strategic network to connect their major administrative centers and frontiers. They then dispatched engineers and legions of Mita laborers to execute this top-down vision, building long-distance trunk roads from scratch. The alternative view proposes a more bottom-up process. For millennia before the Wari, local peoples had created their own networks of footpaths and llama trails to connect villages to pastures and valleys to highlands. The Wari, in this model, acted more like consolidators than creators. They identified the most important of these existing routes, paved them, widened them, and linked them together to form their imperial highway. It was less about inventing a new network and more about upgrading, integrating, and standardizing what was already there. Most likely, the truth is a combination of both. The Wari probably upgraded many existing trails, while also constructing entirely new sections where no path existed before, all in the service of their state. So what was moving along these arteries of empire? You press yourself against the rock wall as another caravan passes. You see llamas laden with bulky sacks and carefully wrapped bundles. This is the empire's supply chain in action. Some sacks contain raw materials for the feasts, dried maize from the warm mid-valleys, potatoes from the highlands, and precious mulberries, carefully harvested and transported to a new provincial center that lacked its own local supply. Other bundles contain the prestige goods that were the currency of Wari diplomacy, stacks of high quality, state-produced caros, and bolts of impossibly fine textiles woven in the workshops of the capital. These were the essential party supplies. Running an empire by feast is, at its core, a massive catering job, and every good caterer knows that success is 90% logistics. And it wasn't just goods. Information traveled these roads. A system of relay runners, the precursors to the famous Inca chasquis, would have sped along these paths, carrying verbal messages from the provinces to the capital and back again. A governor on the frontier could send a request for more supplies or news of arrivals movements and receive a reply in a matter of weeks. The roads, built by labor that was paid for with chicha, were the very conduits that allowed the chicha-based political system to be projected across a vast and challenging geography. But this raises another, even more complex logistical question. How did they know what to send where? You stand on a finished Wari road, watching the llama caravans disappear into the distance. It's one thing to have a road, but it's another thing entirely to know what to send down it. How did the Wari manage the immense logistical challenge of supplying a thirsty empire? How did the governor of a distant outpost like Cerro Baul requisition the thousands of liters of chicha and the tons of food needed for a major feast? He couldn't exactly send an email or fill out a purchase order. This wasn't just about moving stuff. It was about moving the right stuff to the right place at the right time. This required a brain, a complex administrative nervous system. You arrive at one of the great Wari administrative centers, a place like Pikilacta. You walk through the imposing gates into the rigid geometric grid of the city, and you notice one feature that is repeated over and over. Long, narrow, windowless buildings arranged in neat, orderly rows. These are the Quolcas, the imperial storehouses, and they are the key to the entire Wari economic model. This is the state treasury, the imperial bank. But it's not filled with gold or silver. It's filled with what the Wari considered true wealth, tangible goods. You peer into the cool, dark interior of one of these storehouses. In your mind's eye, you see it as it once was. It is packed to the rafters. There are neat stacks of fine textiles bundled and categorized. There are thousands of ceramic vessels, nested one inside the other. But most of the space is taken up by food. Huge bins of hardy, high-altitude quinoa, sacks of dried maize, and most importantly mountains of chuño and moraya, potatoes that have been freeze-dried through a brilliant process of exposing them to the nightly frost and daily sun, turning them into a lightweight, nutrient-dense staple that can be stored for years. This is the state's surplus. This is the capital that funded the feasts, fed the Maita laborers, and provided a crucial buffer against drought and famine. It's like Amazon's central warehouse, but for an ancient empire, and with a much greater emphasis on potatoes. Managing this vast empire-wide inventory without a written language presents a staggering intellectual challenge, and this is where that tantalizing possibility of the Wari Kipu, the knotted cord recording device, becomes so critically important. If a provincial administrator had a kipu, he could create a detailed, portable, and standardized record of his current inventory. He could tie a series of knots on one string to represent his stock of maize, another for his stock of keros. He could then dispatch a runner with this kipu back to a regional capital. The administrator there could read the knotted report and issue a new kipu authorizing a dispatch of goods from a central warehouse to resupply the outpost. Without a system like this, it's hard to see how they could have managed anything beyond a very local level. Even if the Wari Kipu remains elusive, other clues point to a highly numerate and organized administrative mind. The architecture of these centers seems to be based on a decimal or base 10 system. Storage niches are carved into walls in groups of 5 or 10. Buildings are arranged in blocks of 10. This suggests a mindset geared towards counting, grouping, and accounting. They were thinking in a way that is perfectly compatible with a spreadsheet, even if their spreadsheet was made of stone and knotted cords. But how did this empire-wide supply chain actually function? Did all roads lead to the capital, Wari, in a highly centralized system? Or was it a more distributed network? Historians still argue whether the Wari economy was a highly centralized hub-and-spoke system, or a more decentralized regional network. The centralized command economy model imagines that all surplus goods produced in the provinces, all the maize, all the potatoes, all the wool, were funneled to the great storehouses in the capital. The central administration would then process this tribute and redistribute it back out to the provinces as they saw fit. based on strategic needs. This model places maximum power and control in the hands of the emperor and his court. The decentralized model, however, suggests that provincial centers like Cerro Baul were much more autonomous. They would have managed their own local economies, gathering tribute from their immediate hinterlands and storing it in their own quolcas. They would have been responsible for hosting their own feasts and supplying their own mita projects, acting as self-sufficient regional hubs. In this scenario, the capital's role would be more supervisory, coordinating between regions and controlling the production and distribution of only the highest status prestige goods, like the exquisite textiles that only the capital's weavers could produce. It's the ancient difference between a corporate structure, where every tiny decision has to be approved by the head office, versus one that empowers its regional managers. Whichever model is more accurate, the evidence on the ground speaks of a system that, for several centuries, worked brilliantly. The Wari were masters of supply and demand. Their power was not based on overwhelming military force, but on a more subtle and impressive achievement: the ability to conjure abundance, on demand, anywhere within their vast realm. This logistical prowess, while not as dramatic as a battle or a pyramid, is the true secret to how their empire was run. But what was the effect of this state-controlled abundance on the average person? What did they eat when they weren't at a feast, and was a chicha-based society a healthy one? The intricate web of roads, storehouses, and meticulous accounting tells a story of an empire obsessed with supply. But what was the end result of all this logistical mastery on the human body? When you weren't attending a lavish state feast, what did you, an ordinary subject of the Wari Empire, eat for dinner? And was a society that placed a fermented beverage at the center of its political and spiritual life a healthy one? You step away from the grand scale of the state and into the quiet intimacy of a Wari home. The evening meal is being prepared over a small, smoky hearth. The menu is a testament to the incredible agricultural bounty of the Andes, a bounty made accessible by the Wari's control over that vertical archipelago. The cornerstone of the meal is not meat or bread, but tubers. You see potatoes of all shapes and sizes: blue, red, yellow, knobby, smooth. A dazzling variety that puts our modern supermarket selection to shame. Many of them are in the form of chuño, the freeze-dried potato staples from the state storehouses, which are being rehydrated into a hearty, comforting stew. Alongside the potatoes, there is a steaming bowl of quinoa. This nutty, protein-packed grain, now a global superfood, was a workhorse of the Andean diet. There might be some beans as well, and perhaps a side of roasted maize kernels. What about meat? For the common person, meat was not an everyday affair. The llamas and alpacas were too valuable for their wool and as transport animals to be eaten regularly. That was feast food. The most common source of household meat would be the humble guinea pig. The kai, small, easy to raise, and a surprisingly efficient source of protein. It was a diet high in complex carbohydrates, fiber, and plant-based protein. A perfectly sensible and sustainable way to fuel a life of hard agricultural labor. And to drink, there was always chicha. The potent, high-status chicha de mole was reserved for the state-sponsored parties, but a milder, everyday chicha, likely made from maize or quinoa, was a staple in every home. This wasn't just for intoxication. This daily chicha was a crucial part of the nutritional landscape. It was, first and foremost, a major source of calories. In a world of intense physical labor, this liquid energy was vital. The fermentation process also worked a kind of nutritional magic, synthesizing B-complex vitamins that are often deficient in maize-heavy diets. Furthermore, in a world without modern sanitation, drinking a low-alcohol fermented beverage was often safer than drinking from a potentially contaminated stream or spring. The Wari weren't just drinking beer. They were hydrating, getting their vitamins and consuming a significant portion of their daily calories all at once. For them, a liquid lunch wasn't a guilty pleasure. It was a sound nutritional strategy. Now for a surprise. Given this diet, rich in starchy tubers and a sugary fermented drink, you'd expect to find Wari skeletons with mouths full of rotten teeth. But when you, as a bioarchaeologist, examine the skulls of the Wari, you find the opposite. Their rates of dental cavities were remarkably low. How is this possible? Part of the answer is that unlike many other early agricultural societies, the Wari didn't grind most of their grain into fine, abrasive flour for bread. Stone grit in flour acts like sandpaper on tooth enamel. The Wari preferred to boil, toast, or brew their maize, which was much gentler on the teeth. But there's a stranger possibility. Researchers have suggested that the chicha itself, particularly the chicha de Molle, may have had antibacterial properties that actively fought the microbes responsible for tooth decay. So, in a wonderfully counterintuitive twist, the beer that defined their culture may have also been acting as a kind of prehistoric mouthwash. But was the overall picture so rosy? Did life under the Wari state, with its massive food surpluses, make everyone healthier? This is a point of considerable debate. Historians still argue whether the imposition of the Wari state and its economic demands actually improved the overall health of the populace, or in some cases made it worse. On one hand, the state's ability to store and redistribute food in its kulkas would have created an unprecedented buffer against famine. A regional drought might wipe out the potato crop, but the Wari could move in with supplies of maize from their storehouses, saving thousands from starvation. This would have undoubtedly improved health and stability. However, there's a potential downside. The state's immense demand for maize to fuel the political machine of chicha production could have pressured farmers into abandoning their traditional diverse fields. Instead of planting a resilient mix of different potato varieties, quinoa, and legumes, they may have been forced to dedicate more and more land to maize monoculture. A less diverse diet is a less nutritious diet, and relying on a single crop, even one as productive as maize, makes a population far more vulnerable if a specific blight or pest that targets that one crop comes along. It's the ancient version of the tension between diverse subsistence farming and the risks of cash cropping for a demanding central government. For 4 centuries, the Wari managed this balancing act. The storehouses were full, the chicha flowed, the population was relatively healthy, and the empire thrived. But systems of such complexity are often fragile. For 400 years, the Wari managed that complex balancing act. They turned a harsh environment into a source of strength, built a sophisticated logistical network, and perfected a system of political control based on the intoxicating power of generosity. Their cities grew, their roads lengthened, and their influence spread. The storehouses were full, the chicha flowed, and the empire, for all its internal complexities, endured. But all complex systems are fragile. Their very interconnectedness, the source of their strength, can also be the source of their catastrophic failure. And around the year 1000 AD, after centuries of success, the Wari system breaks. You are now a witness to the end of an era. The great party is over and the silence is deafening. You walk the gridded streets of Pikalakta, and they are empty. The wind howls through the high-walled corridors, kicking up dust in halls that once echoed with the sounds of feasting and administration. The immense storehouses stand open and bare. On the imperial roads, the llama caravans no longer run. The empire, once a unified political entity, is fracturing, shattering back into the smaller regional groups from which it was born. This wasn't a slow, gentle decline. It was a rapid unraveling, a collapse that saw one of the Andes' greatest powers simply dissolve in the course of a few generations. What happened? When the taps ran dry, what brought the whole magnificent structure crashing down? The prime suspect, pointed to by evidence drilled from ancient glaciers and dredged from the mud of high-altitude lakes, is the climate. The paleoclimatic record shows that the Andes were struck by another period of intense, prolonged drought beginning in the 11th century. For the Wari state, a political entity fundamentally based on the production and distribution of agricultural surplus, this would have been a death blow. A multi-decade drought would wither the maize crops, the essential ingredient for the state's political chicha. The potato harvest would fail, emptying the great kulkas. The state's promise of abundance, the very bedrock of its legitimacy, would be exposed as a hollow one. The entire social contract was predicated on the state's ability to uphold its end of the bargain. The feasts were the public demonstration of that ability. But what happens when the vats are empty and the roasted llamas are gone? When the people fulfill their mita obligation, but the state can no longer host them with the customary generosity? the reciprocal bond is broken. The subjects are no longer obligated to provide their labor. The whole system of politics by party grinds to a halt. The state's authority, built on a river of beer, evaporates when that river runs dry. But was it just the weather? Perhaps the climate crisis was merely the final push that toppled an empire already rotting from within. After centuries of mighty labor, it's possible that the system came to be seen by the subjects not as a fair exchange, but as a form of exploitation. Local communities may have grown weary of the state's constant demands, seeing their sons and daughters sent away to build cities for a distant, impersonal power. Local elites, once co-opted into the Wari system, may have seen the central states weakening as an opportunity to assert their own independence. The result would have been rebellion, civil strife, and secession, a death by 1,000 cuts. It's like when a company gets too big and bureaucratic, and all its most talented regional managers leave to start their own competing businesses. In the end, historians still argue whether this was a climate-driven collapse, a victim of an unforgiving environment, or a social implosion, a system that simply became too big and rigid to sustain itself. The most likely answer is that it was a devastating feedback loop. The drought created massive stress on the system. The weakened state would have tried to extract even more resources from a suffering population to maintain appearances, which would have fueled resentment and rebellion. This internal conflict would have further crippled the empire's ability to coordinate a response to the environmental crisis. The two forces, external and internal, would have fed upon each other, accelerating the collapse in a vicious spiral. The end, when it came, was not always a quiet fading. In the Wari capital city, Wari itself, archaeological evidence suggests a more dramatic and deliberate conclusion. You see the last of the residents preparing to leave the once great city. But they don't just pack up and go. In a final solemn act, they set fire to the city's most important buildings, the temples, the palaces, the great feasting halls. This was likely not an act of desecration by an enemy, but a ritual of termination by the Wari themselves. It was a ceremonial killing of their own capital, a recognition that the cosmic pact that gave the city its power was broken, and the site had to be formally put to rest. It's the ultimate scorched earth policy, performed on your own home as a final, heartbreaking act of closure. The Wari Empire, born in the crucible of the Andes, was reclaimed by it. But on its southern frontier, at that magnificent brewery in the sky, the story had one final, uniquely Wari chapter to play out. The great Wari ship of state is sinking. In the capital, the fires of ritual termination are consuming the palaces. In the provinces, the bonds of reciprocity are fraying beyond repair. News of the collapse travels slowly, but surely down the stone-paved roads, reaching the distant southern frontier. The message arrives at the sun-drenched fortress of Cerro Baul. The center cannot hold. It is time to come home. The 400-year Wari occupation of this strategic mountain is over. But the departure from Cerro Baul is not a panicked retreat in the face of an advancing enemy. Archaeologists have sifted through every inch of this site, and the story they found is not one of military defeat. There are no layers of ash from a siege, no piles of spent sling stones, no skeletons bearing the marks of battle. Their great rivals, the Tiwanaku, did not conquer this place. The Wari chose to leave on their own terms. And being Wari, they decided to leave with a level of ritual drama and symbolic flair that is simply breathtaking. They didn't just abandon their fortress brewery, they gave it a funeral. And the centerpiece of that funeral was one last, magnificent feast. You are there for the final gathering in the great plaza. The atmosphere is thick with a strange mixture of sorrow, pride, and finality. This is not like the feast you attended before, the one humming with the energy of political negotiation and future obligation. This is a wake. The last of the stores have been brought out. The final batches of chicha de Molle have been decanted from the vats of the great brewery. The Wari governor, the elite brewers, the administrators, and all the colonists who made this mountain their home for generations gather together. The finest carros are filled one last time. Toasts are made not to future projects but to past glories. It is a solemn, deliberate, and deeply communal act of closure. When the final cup is drained, the main event begins. Torches are lit, their flames flickering against the deepening twilight. You watch in awe as a procession of Wari lords and priestesses walks back into the most important buildings on the mountain: the temple, the governor's palace, and the brewery itself. But they don't just set them ablaze. First, they perform a final, shocking act of sacrifice. Inside the feasting halls, they take up the very symbols of their power: the large, ornate serving vessels and the hundreds of beautifully painted carros. These objects, the tools of their political trade, are systematically and intentionally smashed upon the stone floors. The shattering of the ceramics echoes across the plaza, a percussive death knell for an era. With the floors littered with the vibrant shards of their former power, the torches are put to the thatched roofs. The dry timbers catch quickly, and flames roar into the night sky. They are burning everything. The brewery that was the heart of this outpost, the palace that was its brain, the temples that were its soul, all are offered up to a great purifying fire. It is the ultimate termination ritual, an act of such profound symbolic weight it's hard to comprehend. It's like a rock band at the end of its farewell tour, not just smashing their guitars, but setting the entire stadium on fire as they walk off stage. Why would they do this? Why such a dramatic, destructive exit? Historians still argue whether this fiery farewell was an act of despair, a strategic military maneuver, or a display of ultimate pride. Was it a gesture of hopelessness, the last act of a broken people lashing out at the symbols of their failed world? Perhaps. Or was it a cold, calculated, scorched earth policy? They knew they were leaving, and this was their way of denying their Tiwanaku rivals the satisfaction of capturing their prized outpost. They were sending a clear message to the south: you will not have this place. We would rather see it burn than fall into your hands. But there is a third interpretation, one that feels perhaps the most authentically Wari. This may have been an act of profound dignity and ritual propriety. In the Andean worldview, places, like people, had a life force. To abandon a site of such power without formally closing it would be to leave a dangerous, wounded spirit on the landscape. This act of burning and smashing was a ceremonial killing of the site, a way to release its energy back to the cosmos and ensure a clean break. It was not a retreat. It was a planned, honorable decommissioning of a sacred space. They were not being driven out in defeat. They were withdrawing in formation, with their heads held high, leaving nothing but a magnificent ruin behind them. As the flames leap higher, consuming the brewery that for centuries had produced the fuel of empire, the people of Cerro Baul gather their personal belongings. As a community, they walk through the gates for the last time and begin the long, sorrowful journey north, back towards a heartland in chaos. They leave behind a burning pyre on a mountain, a final spectacular monument to the Wari way of life. And in their destructive departure, they unwittingly created a perfect time capsule, an archaeological gift of astonishing richness. That final, fiery act of closure on Cerro Baul was, for the Wari, an end. But for us, 1,000 years later, it was a beginning. It was an unintentional act of perfect preservation. The fire that consumed the brewery's thatched roof caused it to collapse, burying everything on the floor in a thick protective layer. The deliberate smashing of the pottery, an act of ritual finality, meant that no one could come along later and clean up the mess. The Wari, in their dramatic departure, created a perfect, single-moment time capsule. They sealed the evidence of their last party and left it for us to find. Now, fast forward a millennium. The mountain is silent, buried under centuries of dust. You are here, but not as a guest at a feast. You are part of an archaeological team, and you are engaged in a slow, patient act of resurrection. You are inside the burned ruins of one of the great feasting halls. With a soft brush and a trowel, you carefully sweep away the layers of ash and collapsed roofing, and then you find it: the floor. It is a solid carpet of broken pottery, a mosaic of shattered carros and serving plates, exactly where they fell on that last night. It is an archaeologist's dream, a scene of destruction so complete that it is also perfectly preserved. The first task is the painstaking work of traditional archaeology. You map every shard, photograph every fragment. You and the team will spend years in the lab, patiently gluing these pieces back together, reconstructing the beautiful vessels as they once were, like the world's most meaningful and difficult jigsaw puzzle. But the most profound secrets these shards hold are invisible to the naked eye. To find them, you have to move from the archaeology lab to the chemistry lab. Fired clay, the material of these keros, might seem solid and impermeable, but on a microscopic level it's porous. It's a bit like a very hard sponge. Every time a Wari lord filled his cup with chicha, a tiny, infinitesimal amount of that liquid seeped into the ceramic walls. The water would evaporate, but the complex organic molecules, the fats, the waxes, the sugars, the unique chemical signatures of the ingredients, would remain trapped within the clay. For 1,000 years, these shards have been holding the chemical ghost of that final drink. And with modern science, we can exorcise that ghost. You take a small, seemingly insignificant fragment from the floor of the brewery. In the lab, it is cleaned, crushed into a fine powder, and subjected to a battery of chemical tests. One of the most powerful tools in your arsenal is a machine called a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. It's a mouthful, but its function is simple to understand. It's a molecular detective. It can take a complex chemical sample, separate it into its individual components, and then identify each molecule with absolute certainty based on its unique weight and charge. It's the high-tech nose of a forensic scientist. Your target is specific. You want to know if the Wari at Cerro Baul were really drinking chicha made from the Peruvian pepper tree, the Molle. So you are looking for its chemical fingerprint, a biomarker that exists in Shinus Molle and nowhere else. You run the sample. The machine whirs, and data floods onto a screen. And there it is, a clear, unambiguous peak on the graph, a signal that corresponds to a specific type of compound known as a triterpene, which is characteristic of the Molle plant. This is the smoking gun. It's the DNA evidence that proves beyond any doubt that the Wari were not just brewing some kind of beer here, but the specific high-status, politically charged chicha de mole. The stories suggested by the archaeology are now confirmed by the hard data of chemistry. But how much can these amazing techniques really tell us? Historians still argue whether this powerful chemical analysis gives us a true snapshot of the everyday Wari diet, or if it is heavily biased towards the ritually significant special occasion foods that are most likely to be preserved. We find the chemical signature of Molle chicha in the shattered remains of the finest keros, smashed on the floor of a palace during a final dramatic ceremony. Are we surprised? That's exactly where we'd expect to find the good stuff. But this scientific snapshot is of a state dinner, not a Tuesday night supper. Does it tell us what a common farmer was drinking in his home? Does it tell us about the humble root vegetable stew he ate from a wooden bowl that rotted away centuries ago? The risk is that our science, as powerful as it is, ends up amplifying the voices of the elite, while the diet of the common person remains a chemical whisper. Even with these limitations, the combination of traditional excavation and modern chemical analysis has revolutionized our understanding of the Wari. They left us no written recipes, but they left a far more durable record, encoded in the very fabric of the pots they used. The shards from that last fiery feast were a message in a bottle, and after 1,000 years, we have finally learned how to read it. And the story it tells, of a culture built on a sacred beverage, did not end with the flames on Cerro Baul. The tradition and the drink itself would outlive the empire that perfected it. The fires on Cerro Baul eventually burned out, leaving a blackened, silent ruin on its mountaintop. The Wari Empire was gone, its cities left to the wind and dust. But an idea, a successful strategy for organizing human society, is much harder to kill than an empire. The Wari were gone, but the political and social playbook they had written over 400 years was left lying on the landscape for their successors to find. A few centuries of fragmentation and localized conflict follow the Wari collapse. Then around the 1400s, a new power begins to stir in the highlands, rising from a valley right next to the old colossal Wari administrative center of Pikalacta. They call themselves the Inca, and as they begin to build what will become the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas, it becomes clear that they have been studying the work of their great predecessors. You find yourself transported forward in time to a feast in the Inca capital of Cusco. The scale is even grander than what you saw with the Wari, the pageantry even more elaborate. The Sapa Inca, the emperor himself, presides over the ceremony, a living god on earth. But as you look past the golden decorations and the sheer numerical scale, the underlying grammar of the event is startlingly familiar. The state is displaying overwhelming generosity. The finest foods are served in abundance, and the chicha flows in endless streams served in ornate carros. The Inca adopted the Wari model and supercharged it. The Great Wari Road System? The Inca took it, expanded it, and perfected it into their famous Kapak Nyan. The Mita labor draft? The Inca turned it into the engine of their imperial economy, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of workers. The state-run storehouses? The Inca built them by the tens of thousands. The ritual of toasting with paired carros to seal a political alliance, a central feature of Inca diplomacy. The entire Wari philosophy of creating political obligation through state-sponsored feasting was the bedrock upon which the Inca built their empire. They may have rebranded the product. Their preferred chicha was a golden maize-based brew called Aka, but the business model was vintage Wari. Was this a conscious imitation, or a case of two different empires independently arriving at the same solutions to the same Andean challenges? Historians still argue whether the Inca were the conscious heirs of the Wari, deliberately rebuilding an old imperial model, or if they simply arrived at similar solutions independently. It's hard to imagine that the Inca, whose heartland was surrounded by the ghostly monumental ruins of Wari power, were unaware of the legacy of the empire that came before. It seems more likely that they saw what had worked and what hadn't, and deliberately set about reconstructing a new empire based on the successful strategies of the old one. This chicha-fueled system worked for the Inca, just as it had for the Wari, until a new, utterly alien force arrived in 1532. The Spanish conquistadors brought steel, horses, and diseases that shattered the Inca Empire. They toppled the temples and melted down the gold. But there was one institution they could never quite stamp out: the Chicha Hall. In the centuries of colonial rule that followed, brewing and drinking chicha became a profound act of cultural resistance. The Spanish authorities, associating the drink with pagan rituals and drunken disorder, repeatedly tried to ban it. But they failed. For the indigenous Andean people, gathering in a chicheria to share a drink made in the traditional way was an act of defiance, a way of maintaining their social bonds and their cultural identity under the heel of oppression. Every cup was a toast to survival, and that tradition survives to this day. You travel to a small town in the Peruvian Andes in the 21st century. You walk down a dusty street and see a simple house with a long pole sticking out from the doorway, a bright red plastic bag tied to the end. This is not a decoration. This is the traditional sign, the modern equivalent of a neon open sign, indicating that a fresh batch of chicha is for sale inside. You step through the door, into a cool, dark room. A woman, the chichera, greets you with a smile and ladles a glass of the cloudy, effervescent brew from a large clay pot. Farmers, laborers, and friends sit on simple benches, talking, laughing, and sharing a drink that has been a central part of life in these mountains for thousands of years. It survived the Wari, it survived the Inca, it survived the Spanish. That's a pretty impressive track record for a simple homemade beer. The pink Molle chicha of the Wari is a rarity now, a ghost of a drink from a ghost empire. But its golden-hued maize descendant is alive and well. The empire is gone, but the social lubricant that helped to build it remains, now serving not to bind an empire, but to cement the bonds of a community. It is a living, breathing legacy of the Wari world, a taste of a past that is not entirely past. That glass of chicha you tree holding in a modern Andean village is more than just a drink. It's a key. It is a key to understanding that the legacy of the Wari is not just archaeological or historical. The social world that they perfected, the complex system of reciprocity and obligation that their chicha fueled, is not entirely gone. Its echoes are alive and well, not in the ruins of empires, but in the daily life of the communities that call these mountains home. To see it, you just have to look. You are in a small, Quechua-speaking village, perched high on a mountainside. It is the time of the potato harvest. The sky is a brilliant, almost violent blue, but dark clouds are gathering over the highest peaks, signaling the coming of the afternoon rains. One family is working frantically in their field, a patchwork of earth clinging to the steep slope. They will never get all the potatoes in before the rain turns the soil to mud. They are alone, and they are losing the race. You return the next morning. The scene has been transformed. The family is no longer alone. A dozen of their neighbors are in the field with them, laughing and talking as their hoes turn the earth, revealing the colorful potatoes within. By midday, the harvest is done, the potatoes safely stored. No money has changed hands. No contracts were signed. You have just witnessed a practice as old as the mountains themselves. You have seen Aini. This is that foundational Andean principle of reciprocal labor exchange. The family that received help today is now in debt to its neighbors, a debt they will happily repay when it is their neighbor's turn to harvest or roof a house or plant a field. This intimate, community-level web of mutual obligation is the very same social technology that the Wari took and scaled up to an imperial level. Here, you see it in its purest, most essential form. A few weeks later, the village leader announces that the main irrigation canal, the artery that brings life-giving water to all the community's fields, is choked with silt from the last rainy season. It must be cleared before the next planting. No single family can do this work alone. The leader calls for a minka, a communal work party. On the designated day, a member of every household in the village turns up, shovel or pickaxe in hand. The work is hard, hours spent digging out heavy, wet mud under the intense sun, but the atmosphere is not one of grim toil. It is festive. People chant and sing as they work. Jokes are shouted from one end of the canal to the other. It is a social event as much as it is a public works project. And then, at noon, the work stops. The village leader's family appears carrying enormous pots. They lay out a meal for the entire workforce, a mountain of potatoes, a hearty quinoa stew, and of course they bring buckets of fresh, frothy chicha, which they ladle out to the thirsty workers. You watch as a man, his face streaked with mud, takes a cup, thanks the leader, and drinks deeply. The scene is a perfect, living diorama of the Wari system. A leader demonstrates his legitimacy and generosity by providing a feast. The community, in return, provides the labor needed for a vital public project. The scale is a village canal instead of an imperial highway, but the political and social logic is identical. The ancient contract is still in force. How have these practices survived for 1,000 years? Through the rise and fall of empires, through conquest and colonization? It's a profound question. Historians still argue whether these traditions represent a direct, unbroken cultural lineage stretching back to the Wari and Inca, or if they are, to some extent, reinventions of tradition. Are you seeing a perfect cultural fossil? A practice passed down unchanged through 40 generations? Or are you seeing a brilliant adaptation? Some argue that in the face of the Spanish colonial and later modern cash economies, which often sought to exploit their labor, Andean communities consciously strengthened these non-market reciprocal traditions as a form of cultural and economic self-defense. They leaned into their own ancestral ways to maintain solidarity and resist outside pressures. Whichever is true, an unbroken stream or a resilient reinvention, the result is the same. The fundamental principles of Wari political life are not dead. You can see them in every act of Aini. You can taste them in the chicha served at every minka. The ghost of the Wari state, stripped of its imperial scale but not its core logic, still walks these mountains. It is a quiet, powerful testament to the idea that a society can be built not on currency or coercion, but on the simple, powerful human bond created by sharing work, sharing food, and sharing a drink. You stand in that modern village, the scent of dust and chicha on the air, and you watch the living echo of a system 1,000 years dead. The scale has collapsed from an empire to a community, but the core logic, the human software of reciprocity, continues to run. And as our journey through this lost world comes to an end, we find ourselves back where we started, on that high wind-scoured plateau, standing among the silent ruins of a Wari city. But the ruins are not silent to you anymore. You can see them now. You can see the ghosts. You see the elite women managing the brewery, their knowledge a form of state secret, You see the llama caravans picking their way up the stone staircases of the imperial road, laden with the ingredients for a feast. You see the governor on Cerro Baul, raising a pair of matched carros to toast a rival, a silent negotiation in a cold war of hospitality. You hear the rhythmic scrape of grinding stones, the chanting of Mita laborers building a perfectly gridded city, and the roar of the crowd as the chicha is poured in the great plaza. You see a civilization that, faced with the challenge of building a cohesive state without writing, without money, and without markets, devised one of the most ingenious solutions in human history. Their genius was not technological but psychological. They understood on a profound level what truly motivates people, what binds them together, and what makes them loyal. They knew that a gift is more powerful than a command. They knew that a shared meal and a shared drink could forge a bond stronger than any iron chain. They took the ancient, intimate village-level ethic of reciprocity and weaponized it, scaling it up with logistical mastery into a tool of imperial statecraft. They didn't need to rule by brute force because they could govern by creating a web of social debt so vast and so powerful that it became the very fabric of society. And the catalyst for this entire reaction, the universal solvent for their politics, religion, and social life, was chicha, a simple beer made from the berries of a hardy local tree. Think of all it accomplished. It was a sacred offering that nourished their gods and ancestors. It was a social lubricant that fueled the feasts that created political obligation. It was a wage, paid in advance, to the laborers who built their empire. It was a nutritional supplement that provided calories and vitamins. It was a status symbol, served in cups that broadcast a complex social hierarchy. And it was a marker of identity, the taste of the Wari state. It is hard to imagine any other single substance in history that has been so completely integrated into every single facet of a civilization's existence. It really makes our modern obsession with coffee look a bit one-dimensional, doesn't it? Studying the Wari forces us to question our own assumptions about what makes a society advanced. We equate complexity and power with writing, with currency, with standing armies. The Wari show us a different path. They built an empire on social capital. They created a world where the most important contracts were unwritten, where the treasury was filled with potatoes instead of gold, and where the most powerful political statement you could make was to throw a really, really good party. They were the ultimate soft power empire, a civilization that understood that while fear can control people for a time, a sense of obligation, freely entered into, can last for generations. They remain a ghost empire, their own voices lost to time. We will never be able to read a history of the Wari written by a Wari historian, but they left us their story all the same, written in the language of their art, encoded in the chemistry of their pottery, and laid out in the grand geometric plans of their silent cities. By listening closely to these echoes, by piecing together the shards they left behind, we can begin to understand their remarkable achievement. They unlocked a fundamental truth about human nature, that the strongest form of power is not the ability to compel, but the ability to give. They built their world one drink at a time, a testament to the idea that sometimes the most sophisticated tool of statecraft is a simple, shared cup. And so you stand on the summit of Cerro Baul one last time, as the sun sets and the desert air grows cold. You see the ghosts of that final feast, the flames of that final fire. An ending, yes, but also a legacy of ingenuity and a profound understanding of the human heart. A story that waited 1,000 years in the dust for us to come and listen. The last of the light fades from the sky and the sharp, brilliant stars of the high Andes begin to appear, scattered like jewels on black velvet. The wind that whispers through these ancient stones is the only sound now, a soft, ceaseless sigh that has outlasted empires. The grand story is over, the journey is done, and the ghosts of the Wari can finally rest. Here on their mountaintop, all is quiet, and in your own quiet room the soft hum of the fan is the only sound. The past recedes, folding back into the gentle dark, leaving you with just the echo of a story, a faint taste of a peppery, pink beer. It's time now to let the silence settle, to let the images fade. The story is safe. You can let it go.